Jake Brennan had seen wild horses run from humans his entire life, but this mare walked straight toward him and begged. Her baby was drowning in the current behind her, and he had minutes to enter the freezing water or let the foal die. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels on either side of Jake Brennan as he guided his chestnut gelding, Copper, along the narrow trail that wound through the heart of Red Rock country. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern rim, leaving the canyon floor in shadow, cool and deep. Though the sky above blazed with the promise of another scorching August day, Jake had been riding since before dawn, checking the water sources scattered across his family's sprawling ranch, and this particular spring, tucked into a fold of red sandstone, was the last on his list. He was tired, ready to head home to the breakfast his mother would have waiting, but something made him pause as he rounded the final bend. Copper's ears pricked forward, and the horse's butai changed from relaxed to alert in an instant. Jake knew better than to ignore his horse's instincts. In 20 years of ranching in this unforgiving country, he had learned that animals often sense trouble long before humans did. He reined in Copper and sat perfectly still, listening to the canyon's whispers. At first, he heard nothing but the wind moving through the sage and the distant cry of a hawk, circling high above the canyon rim. Then it came, a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a horse's whinny, high and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls with a note of pure panic that no cowboy could mistake. This wasn't the casual greeting of one horse to another, or the frustrated complaint of an animal caught in brush. This was the sound of terror, of a creature facing something it couldn't fight or escape. Jake touched his heels to Copper's sides, and the gelding responded immediately, moving forward with careful precision along the rocky trail. They had worked together for so long that communication between them required little more than thought and touch. Copper understood urgency when he felt it in his rider's body, and he understood caution when the trail grew treacherous beneath his hooves. They moved as one creature, man and horse, united by purpose and years of partnership. The spring revealed itself gradually as they descended into the small box canyon where it pooled. What should have been a peaceful watering hole, a place where wildlife gathered in the early morning and evening hours, had become the stage for a nightmare. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. A wild mare, her coat the color of desert sand touched with gold, stood at the water's edge, her body trembling with distress. She was a Mustang, one of the wild horses that still roamed these canyons despite decades of human encroachment, and she was magnificent even in her terror. But it wasn't the mare that held Jake's attention. It was what lay in the water before her, struggling weakly against the current that pulled at its small body. A foal, no more than a few weeks old, had somehow fallen into the spring-fed pool and was trapped against a partially submerged log. The baby's cream-colored head barely broke the surface, its eyes wide with exhaustion and fear, its small hooves churning uselessly as it tried to find purchase on the slippery rocks beneath the water. Jake understood the situation instantly. The spring, swollen by recent rains in the high country, had created a deceptive pool deeper and faster moving than usual. The foal must have ventured too close to the edge, perhaps to drink, and the soft mud had given way beneath its weight. Now the current, though not strong enough to be immediately dangerous to a full-grown horse, was more than sufficient to hold a baby down, to exhaust it, to eventually pull it under when its strength finally gave out. The mare saw him then, and Jake expected her to bolt. Wild horses didn't trust humans, with good reason given the history of roundups and captures that had decimated their numbers over the years, but this mother didn't run. Instead, she did something that would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. She took 3 deliberate steps toward him, her eyes locked on his, and she called out again. It wasn't the panic-stricken whinny he had heard before. This was different, lower, more purposeful. It was, Jake realized with a shock that went through him like electricity, a plea. The mare was asking for help. She had tried to reach her baby and failed, had stood guard over the struggling foal for what must have been hours, unable to save her own offspring but unwilling to abandon it. And now, faced with a human, her natural enemy, she was making a choice that went against every instinct bred into her wild bloodline. She was asking him to save what she could not. Jake dismounted slowly, his hands held out to show he meant no harm, though he wasn't sure why he bothered with the gesture. The mare wasn't watching his hands. She was watching his eyes, reading his intention with the ancient wisdom that prey animals develop when their lives depend on understanding predators. She saw something there that made her step back, not in flight but in permission, giving him access to the water's edge where her baby struggled. Copper stood absolutely still, ground-rained by habit and training, watching the scene unfold with the same intense focus his rider showed. The gelding understood on some level that this was important, that the wild mare's trust was a gift as rare as it was fragile, that any sudden movement or sound could shatter the tenuous connection forming between human and Mustang. The foal's struggles were growing weaker. Jake could see that it didn't have much time left. The cold water was sapping its strength, and exhaustion was pulling it toward surrender. He had perhaps minutes, maybe less, to figure out how to reach the baby without spooking the mother, without getting himself trapped in the same current, without making a situation that was already desperate into something fatal for them all. Jake's mind raced through possibilities as he approached the water's edge, each option weighing against the realities of the situation. The pool was deeper than it looked, fed by an underground spring that created a current strong enough to hold the foal against the submerged log. The water was clear enough to see the rocky bottom in the shallows, but toward the center where the baby struggled, it darkened to an opaque turquoise that spoke of significant depth. He couldn't wade in from where he stood. The banks were too steep, cut away by years of water flow, and the mud that had betrayed the foal would do the same to him if he wasn't careful. He needed to come at this from an angle, to use his rope and his experience to reach the baby without putting himself in a position where he couldn't help either of them. His father had taught him long ago that the worst thing a rescuer could do was become another victim, that good intentions without smart execution saved no one. The mare watched his every move, her nostrils flaring as she tested his scent on the morning air. She was a beautiful animal, probably 4 or 5 years old, in her prime, with the muscular build and alert intelligence that characterized the Mustangs who survived in this harsh country. Her mane was tangled with burrs and her coat bore the scars of life in the wild, but there was something regal about her bearing, something that commanded respect, even in her current state of desperate need. Jake moved slowly to Copper's side and retrieved his lariat from where it hung on his saddle. The rope was worn smooth from years of use, its weight and balance as familiar to him as his own hands. He had been roping since he was old enough to throw a loop, had learned the art from his grandfather, who had learned it from his grandfather before him. It was more than a skill passed down through generations. It was a language, a way of communicating with animals and the land itself. He studied the foal's position, calculating distances and angles. The baby was perhaps 15 feet from the bank, close enough to reach with a rope, but far enough that the throw would need to be perfect. The current was pushing the foal against the log, which was both helping and hurting, and the obstruction kept the baby from being swept further into the pool, but it also trapped the small body in a position where its head could barely stay above water. Any moment now, the exhausted creature would slip beneath the surface, and if that happened, there would be no second chances. The challenge was getting a loop around the foal without frightening it into thrashing, which would only make things worse. Terrified animals often fought against rescue, their panic overriding any understanding that help was being offered. Jake needed the baby to stay as calm as possible, to accept the rope when it came, to trust in a way that wild things rarely did with human intervention. He built his loop carefully, making it larger than he would for a full-grown horse, sizing it to slip over the foal's head and shoulders without choking. The mare stepped closer as she watched him work, her ears forward, her entire being focused on what he was doing with an intensity that was almost unnerving. It was as if she understood that this human with his strange tools represented her baby's only chance, or that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her offspring lived or died. Jake tested the weight of the loop, feeling the rope respond to his movements like an extension of his arm. He had thrown thousands of loops in his lifetime, at calves and steers, at fence posts during practice sessions, at targets both moving and still. But this was different. This wasn't about speed or competition or proving skill. This was about a life hanging in the balance, about a mother's desperate trust, about doing what was right because it needed doing regardless of the risk involved. The foal's head dipped below the water for a moment and then surfaced again, its breathing labored and irregular. Time was running out. Jake positioned himself at the best angle he could find, bracing his feet against the rocky ground, coiling the excess rope in his left hand, while the loop waited ready in his right. He took a breath, centered himself the way his grandfather had taught him, and made his throw. The loop sailed through the morning air with perfect rotation, opening as it flew, descending toward its target with the precision of long practice. But at the last second the foal shifted, perhaps sensing something above it, and the loop missed by inches. Splashing into the water beside the struggling baby, Jake cursed under his breath and pulled the rope back quickly, water streaming from the hemp as he recoiled it for another attempt. The mare made a sound then, something between a whimper and a grunt, and Jake glanced at her to find those dark eyes fixed on him with an expression he would have sworn was pleading. She was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate across the vast divide that separated their species. He felt the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders like a physical burden, felt the responsibility of this moment pressing down on him with an intensity that made his hands shake slightly as he rebuilt his loop. He couldn't fail, wouldn't fail. This foal would not die here today, not while he had breath in his body and rope in his hands. He blocked out everything else, the mare's watching eyes, Copper's patient stance, the growing heat of the day, the ache in his tired muscles. There was only the target, only the baby whose life depended on his skill, only the loop that needed to find its mark. Jake threw again. This time the loop sailed true, settling over the foal's head and neck with gentle precision. The baby felt the rope and panicked, thrashing weakly against this new constraint, but Jake was already moving, taking up the slack carefully, keeping the pressure steady, but not tight, not choking, just firm enough to maintain contact. The mare nickered softly, perhaps trying to calm her offspring, perhaps simply responding to the sight of help, finally connecting with her struggling baby. Now came the delicate part. Jake had the foal secured with his rope, but pulling a frightened animal through water required a careful balance between firmness and gentleness. Too much force and he could injure the baby or cause it to panic further. Too little and the current would win, would drag the exhausted creature under before he could get it to safety. He needed to time this perfectly, to work with the foal's remaining strength rather than against it. He dug his heels into the rocky ground and began to pull, steady and measured, feeling the weight of the small body at the other end of his rope. The foal resisted at first, its wild instincts screaming against this strange restraint, but the current was stronger than its fear. The water pushed the baby toward the bank as Jake pulled, and slowly, inch by precious inch, the distance between them closed. The mare moved along the bank parallel to her offspring's path, calling out in a voice that seemed designed to encourage rather than alarm. Jake had never heard a horse make sounds quite like these, had never witnessed the complex communication between a mother and her baby under such extreme circumstances. The foal's ears would flick toward its mother's voice, even as it struggled, seeking comfort in the familiar sound amid the terror and confusion of drowning Copper remained statue still where Jake had left him, understanding through the mysterious connection between well-trained horses and their riders that his job was simply to be there, to be a steady presence, to not add any additional chaos to an already chaotic situation. The gelding's calm seemed to help stabilize the mare as well, giving her another horse to focus on, perhaps reminding her that not all creatures would harm her or her baby. The foal was halfway to the bank when disaster struck. The rope, slick with water and pulled at an angle that put pressure on the submerged log, suddenly snagged on something beneath the surface. Jake felt the change immediately, the way the line went from flexible and responsive to rigid and stuck. He tried adjusting his angle, tried giving slack and taking it up again, but whatever had caught the rope held fast. The foal, sensing the change in tension, began to thrash more violently. Its head went under for several seconds before surfacing again, water streaming from its nostrils, its eyes rolling white with terror. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he realized the rope that was supposed to save the baby might end up drowning it if he couldn't free the snag immediately. He made a split-second decision, the kind that separated experienced cowboys from novices, the kind that either saved lives or ended them. He dropped the rope, letting it go slack in the water, and began stripping off his boots. The mare watched him with wild eyes as he pulled off his heavy workshirt, understanding on some instinctive level that the human was preparing to enter the water, to put himself at risk for her offspring. Jake's father would have called him a fool. The water was cold despite the summer heat, fed by springs that had their source deep underground where the sun never reached. The current was strong enough to be dangerous, and he had no idea what obstacles waited beneath that deceptive surface, but the foal was drowning. The rope was snagged, and there was no other choice that he could see. He waded in from the shallows, feeling the shocking cold bite through his jeans and steal his breath. The bottom was slippery with algae and loose stones that shifted treacherously beneath his feet. He moved carefully, using his hands against the bank for balance, working his way toward where the rope disappeared into the deeper water. The current tugged at his legs with surprising strength, reminding him that this spring was more powerful than it appeared. The mare whinnied sharply, a warning or encouragement, he couldn't tell which, and he glanced up to see her pacing along the bank, her anxiety manifesting in nervous energy that had her moving in tight circles. She wanted to help, but didn't know how, wanted to save her baby but lacked the means, and so she watched this human risk his own life with an intensity that bordered on worship. Jake reached the spot where the rope had snagged and took a deep breath before ducking his head beneath the surface. The cold water shocked his system, making his chest tighten and his head pound, but he forced his eyes open and peered through the murky depths. The rope had wrapped around a submerged branch, part of a tree that must have fallen into the spring during a past flood and become wedged between rocks. He worked at the tangle with numb fingers, trying to free the line without losing his grip in the current. His lungs began to burn, demanding air, but he stayed under for another precious few seconds, finally managing to work the rope free from its snag. He surfaced with a gasp, wiping water from his eyes, and immediately grabbed the line again. The foal was barely conscious now, its struggles reduced to weak twitches, its head lolling dangerously low in the water. No time for gentleness anymore. No time for careful, measured pulls. Jake hauled on the rope with all his strength, pulling hand over hand, dragging the baby through the water with a force that would have been dangerous under other circumstances, but was now the only thing standing between the foal and death. The current fought him, trying to reclaim its prize, but Jake's determination was stronger than the spring's hunger. The mare saw her baby coming closer and moved to the very edge of the bank. Her hooves churning at the mud in her eagerness to reach her offspring. Jake could see her muscles bunching, could sense her preparing to do something reckless, and he called out to her without thinking, his voice sharp with command. The Mustang's ears flicked toward him, and she froze, held in place by the authority in his tone, if not by understanding. The foal reached the shallows where Jake could get his hands on the small body, and he gathered the baby into his arms with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the desperate strength he had used to pull it from the current. The little creature was frighteningly limp, its eyes half closed, water dripping from its muzzle and ears. For a terrible moment, Jake thought he was too late, that the life had already fled from this small being despite all his efforts. Then the foal coughed, a weak, raspy sound, and water streamed from its nostrils. Its sides heaved as it struggled to draw breath, and Jake felt relief flood through him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. The baby was alive, exhausted, hypothermic, terrified but alive. He waded toward the bank, cradling the foal against his chest, talking to it in a low, steady voice, though he had no idea if the creature could hear him or understand that the danger had passed. The mare met them at the water's edge, and what happened next would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. Instead of snatching her baby away from the human who held it, instead of showing the fear and aggression he would have expected from a wild horse, she pressed her nose gently against the foal's wet face and nickered softly. Then she looked at Jake, and in her eyes he saw something that transcended species, that spoke to the universal language of gratitude and trust that exists between mothers and those who help protect their young. Jake laid the foal carefully on a patch of sandy ground away from the muddy bank, positioning it so that its head was slightly elevated to help drain any remaining water from its lungs. The baby was shivering violently now, its small body racked with tremors that spoke of how close it had come to death. He needed to warm it up, needed to get its core temperature rising before shock set in and finished what the water had started. He moved quickly to Copper and retrieved the heavy wool saddle blanket from beneath his tack. The blanket was warm from being pressed against the gelding's back, and Jake wrapped it around the foal's small body, covering everything except its head. The mare watched every movement with intense focus, but she made no move to interfere. It was as if she understood that the human was still helping, that his actions were meant to heal rather than harm. The foal's breathing was improving, becoming deeper and more regular, though the shivering continued. That was actually a good sign. Jake knew shivering meant the body was trying to generate heat, was fighting to survive. He knelt beside the baby and began rubbing its legs and sides through the blanket, trying to stimulate circulation and warm the cold-shocked muscles. His own body was starting to feel the effects of his time in the frigid water, his teeth wanting to chatter, but he ignored his own discomfort in favor of focusing on his patient. The mare moved closer, her muzzle nearly touching Jake's shoulder as she inspected her offspring. He could feel her warm breath on his neck, could smell the distinctive scent of horse that was somehow both wild and familiar. She was so close that he could have reached out and touched her, could have run his hand along her neck or scratched behind her ears the way he did with Copper. But he didn't. This was her choice, this proximity, and he wouldn't violate the trust she had placed in him by pushing for more connection than she was willing to give. The sun had finally cleared the canyon rim, and golden light spilled down the red rock walls like liquid honey. The temperature began to rise immediately as the solar warmth reached them, and Jake positioned the foal so that the sunlight fell directly on its wrapped body. Every bit of heat would help. Every degree of warmth could mean the difference between recovery and decline. As the minutes passed, the baby's condition continued to improve. Its eyes opened fully, blinking against the bright morning light, and its head lifted with more strength than it had shown since Jake first pulled it from the water. The mare touched her nose to her offspring's face repeatedly, making soft, wuffling sounds that seemed designed to comfort and reassure. The foal responded with small nickers of its own, weak but present, acknowledging its mother's presence. Jake sat back on his heels, still keeping one hand on the foal to monitor its condition, and allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. His heart was still racing from the adrenaline of the rescue, and his hands shook slightly with the after-effects of stress and cold water. He had done dangerous things before in his life as a rancher, had faced angry bulls and broken horses, had weathered storms and accidents that could have killed him. But this felt different somehow. This felt like he had been part of something larger than himself, something that connected him to the wild heart of this country in a way he had never experienced before. Copper nickered softly from where he stood ground-tied, and the mare's head swung toward the gelding with interest. For a moment the two horses regarded each other, domestic and wild, separated by generations of breeding and training, yet still connected by their fundamental horseness. The mare took a tentative step toward Copper, her nostrils flaring as she tested his scent, and the gelding responded by lowering his head in a gesture that was neither threatening nor submissive, simply acknowledgement of another of his kind. The foal tried to stand, its legs trembling with effort, and Jake helped support the small body as it struggled to get its feet beneath it. The baby was a filly, he noticed now. A little girl who would grow up to be as magnificent as her mother if she survived the challenges of life in the wild. She managed to get her front legs straightened, then her back legs, and for a moment she stood swaying on unsteady hooves before collapsing back down onto the blanket. The mare nickered encouragingly and moved back to her baby, positioning herself so that the foal could lean against her front legs for support. It was clear she wanted her offspring up and moving, wanted to get away from this place that had nearly claimed her daughter's life. But the baby wasn't ready yet, needed more time to recover strength before it could make the journey to wherever the wild band called home. Jake made a decision, then that would have surprised anyone who knew him, as the practical, no-nonsense rancher he had always been. He wasn't leaving until he was certain the foal could travel safely with her mother. It didn't matter that he was cold and wet, that his breakfast was growing cold at home, that he had a dozen other tasks waiting for his attention. This little family needed him, and he would stay as long as they did. He retrieved his shirt from where he had discarded it and pulled it on over his damp skin, grimacing at the clammy feel of wet denim against his legs. His boots were still where he had left them, and he tugged them on, feeling water squelch uncomfortably around his toes. It would be a miserable ride home later, but that was a problem for future Jake to worry about. Present Jake had a foal to monitor and a wild mare to keep calm. The sun climbed higher, its warmth becoming more intense as the morning advanced. The foal dozed fitfully beneath the blanket, her small sides rising and falling with breathing that was growing stronger by the minute. The mare stayed close, sometimes touching her nose to her baby, sometimes raising her head to scan the canyon rim for threats. She was torn, Jake could see, between her need to flee this place and her understanding that her daughter wasn't ready to travel. He used the waiting time to study the mare more carefully. She was a beautiful example of her kind, probably carrying bloodlines that traced back to the Spanish horses that had first populated these mountains centuries ago. Her conformation was good, her legs straight and strong, her chest deep enough to suggest excellent wind capacity. She would be fast, he thought, and tough enough to survive in country that killed weaker animals without mercy. There were scars on her hide, evidence of encounters with predators or perhaps fights with other horses over resources or dominance. One particular mark on her shoulder looked like it might have been from a mountain lion's claws, though she had clearly survived the attack and healed well. Each scar told a story of survival, of a life lived on the edge where weakness meant death and strength meant another day. Jake found himself wondering about her history, about where she had come from and what had led her to this particular canyon on this particular morning. Did she have a stallion, a band that would be looking for her? Were there other foals in her group, siblings to this baby girl who had come so close to dying? The wild horses moved through this country in patterns that followed water and grass and the seasons, migrating between winter and summer ranges with a reliability that suggested generations of learned behavior. The foal stirred and tried again to stand. This time she made it to her feet and stayed there, swaying slightly but upright, her long legs looking impossibly fragile beneath her small body. The mare whickered with what sounded like pride and moved to her daughter's side, offering her flank for the baby to nurse if she was hungry. The foal nuzzled at her mother's belly but didn't seem interested in feeding yet, perhaps still too exhausted or perhaps with her stomach too full of accidentally swallowed spring water. Jake stood slowly, not wanting to startle the baby now that she was finally up and moving. He carefully removed the saddle blanket from around the foal, folding it and walking back to Copper to replace it on his saddle. The mare watched him move away from her offspring, her ears tracking his position. Even as her body relaxed slightly with the increased distance, Copper greeted him with a soft nicker, and Jake spent a moment running his hands over the gelding's neck, taking comfort in the solid warmth of his partner. They had been through so much together over the years, and this morning's adventure would be added to the collection of memories that bound them. The horse had stood patiently through the entire rescue, never pulling at his reins or showing concern, trusting that his human knew what he was doing even when the situation seemed desperate. The foal took a tentative step, then another, her coordination improving as her muscles warmed and her strength returned. She was going to be all right, Jake realized with deep satisfaction. The near drowning hadn't caused any permanent damage that he could see, and with her mother's milk and the resilience of youth, she would probably recover completely within a day or two. The mare seemed to sense the same thing, her body language shifting from anxious to merely watchful. Jake knew it was time to let them go, to step back and allow nature to reclaim what he had briefly held in his hands. The mare and her baby belonged to the wild, and his role in their story was finished. He had done what he could, had pulled one small life back from the edge of death, and that was enough. It had to be enough. But the mare surprised him one final time. Instead of immediately heading for the canyon mouth and freedom, she walked directly toward Jake, her hooves deliberate on the rocky ground. He stood very still, barely breathing, as she approached to within arm's length. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, human and horse, civilized and wild, separated by so much yet connected by what had happened here this morning. Then the mare did something extraordinary. She lowered her head and exhaled softly against Jake's chest, her warm breath flowing over his damp shirt. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even affection, the kind of thing a horse might do with a herd mate it trusted. She was thanking him, Jake realized with a lump forming in his throat. This wild creature who had never known a gentle human touch was offering her gratitude in the only way she knew how. He lifted his hand slowly, giving her every chance to move away, and when she didn't, he placed his palm gently on her neck. Her coat was warm from the sun and coarser than Copper's carefully groomed hide, and beneath his fingers he could feel the powerful muscles that carried her across this unforgiving landscape. For perhaps 10 seconds they stayed like that, connected by touch and by shared experience, and Jake felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to live in harmony with the wild things. Then the mare stepped back, breaking the contact, and returned to her foal. The baby was moving more confidently now, taking small exploratory steps around her mother, testing her recovered strength. The mare touched her nose to her daughter's back, then looked toward the canyon mouth. It was time to go. Jake watched as the mare began to lead her foal toward the canyon mouth, moving slowly to accommodate her daughter's still uncertain gait. The baby stayed close to her mother's side, occasionally leaning against the larger horse for support, but growing steadier with each step. They moved as one unit, mother and child bound by instinct and love, heading back toward whatever wild sanctuary they called home. They had gone perhaps 20 yards when the mare stopped and turned back to look at Jake. He raised his hand in farewell, a gesture that felt simultaneously inadequate and perfect. The mare stood for a moment, silhouetted against the brightening canyon, then tossed her head once before continuing on. The foal looked back too, her large dark eyes meeting his briefly before her mother urged her forward. Then they rounded a bend in the canyon wall and were gone, vanished into the red rock landscape as if they had never been. Jake stood alone beside the spring that had nearly claimed the foal's life, listening to the silence that settled over the canyon. Once they left, Copper walked over to stand beside him, the gelding's presence a comfort as the adrenaline of the morning finally began to drain from Jake's system, leaving him feeling hollow and somehow changed. He couldn't quite articulate what was different, but something fundamental had shifted in him during those desperate minutes in the cold water. The ride home took longer than usual because Jake kept stopping to look back, half hoping to catch another glimpse of the wild mare and her baby. He knew it was foolish. They would be miles away by now, moving through country they knew far better than he did, following paths that existed only in the inherited memory of their kind. But he couldn't help searching the distant hills and shadowed canyons, wondering if he would ever see them again or if this morning would remain an isolated moment of connection between his world and theirs. His mother was waiting on the porch when he finally rode into the ranch yard, her arms crossed and her expression hovering between worry and annoyance. Margaret Brennan was a formidable woman who had raised 3 sons after her husband's death, managing the ranch with an iron will and a tender heart that she tried to hide beneath practicality. She took one look at Jake's damp clothes and the exhaustion on his face, and her expression shifted entirely to concern. "What happened to you?" she demanded, hurrying down the steps to meet him as he dismounted. "You look like you've been swimming in your clothes." Jake tied Copper to the porch rail and turned to face his mother. Suddenly aware of how the morning's events would sound when spoken aloud, he had rescued a wild foal from drowning. He had risked his own life in cold water for an animal that would never be his, that he would likely never see again. It seemed like the act of a madman when viewed through the lens of practical ranch management. But when he opened his mouth to explain, what came out was the truth, unvarnished and emotional. "I saved a baby," he said simply. "A wild foal that fell in the spring up at Red Rock Canyon. The mother asked me to help, and I couldn't say no." His mother's expression went through several rapid changes as she processed this information. Margaret had lived her entire life in this country and knew the ways of wild horses, knew they didn't ask humans for help, knew they fled from human contact whenever possible. But she also knew her son, knew he didn't exaggerate or invent stories, knew that if he said it happened, then it happened exactly as he described. "Tell me everything," she said, and they sat on the porch steps while he recounted the morning's adventure. She listened without interrupting, her work-worn hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. When he described the moment when the mare approached him and exhaled against his chest, he saw tears form in his mother's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. "Your father would have been proud," she said quietly when he finished. "He always said that a man's worth could be measured by how he treated the helpless, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. You risked yourself for something that couldn't repay you, and that's the mark of true character." The words hit Jake harder than he expected, and he found himself blinking back his own tears. His father had been dead for 10 years, killed in a ranching accident that still haunted the family, and Jake had spent those years trying to be the man his father had trained him to be. Hearing his mother say he had succeeded in some small way felt like absolution for a guilt he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Over the next few days, Jake found himself thinking constantly about the wild mare and her foal. He went about his usual work, mending fences and checking cattle, moving irrigation pipes and breaking young horses. But part of his mind was always in that canyon, reliving those desperate minutes when a life hung in the balance. He wondered if the foal had fully recovered, if she was nursing properly, if she would grow strong enough to survive her first winter in the high country. Word of the rescue spread through the ranching community with the mysterious speed that news always traveled in rural areas. Other cowboys stopped by to hear the story firsthand, and most of them looked at Jake with a mixture of respect and bafflement. Wild horses were common enough in the region, but interactions like the one Jake described were virtually unheard of. Some of the old-timers nodded knowingly and shared their own stories of strange encounters with wild things, moments when the barrier between human and animal seemed to thin and something profound passed between species. His younger brother Tom thought he was crazy. "You risked your life for a Mustang that's probably already dead from some other cause," Tom said over dinner one night. "Mountain lions, coyotes, accidents, starvation. Wild foals have maybe a 50-50 chance of making it to adulthood. You could have been killed for nothing, but Jake didn't see it that way. The foal might die tomorrow or next week or next year. That was the harsh reality of life in the wild. But she hadn't died that morning in the spring, and that made all the difference. He had given her a chance, had tipped the scales in favor of life over death, and what happened after that was up to her and her mother and the land itself." 3 weeks passed before Jake allowed himself to return to the canyon. He told himself he was busy with ranch work, which was true enough. August brought its own demands, and there were irrigation systems to maintain, hay to cut and bale, and a string of young horses that needed training before the fall sales. But the real reason he stayed away was fear. He was afraid of what he might find, or more accurately, what he might not find. The canyon would show him whether his rescue had meant anything or whether nature had simply claimed the foal through some other means. Finally, on a morning when the work was caught up and his mother shooed him out of the house with instructions to stop moping around like a lovesick teenager, Jake saddled Copper and headed back toward Red Rock Canyon. The ride felt different this time, weighted with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The landscape looked the same. Red stone and blue sky and endless grass moving in waves beneath the wind. But Jake saw it through changed eyes. Every shadow could hide a wild horse. Every distant movement could be the mare and her baby. He approached the spring cautiously, not wanting to disturb anything if they happened to be there. The pool looked peaceful in the morning light, its surface reflecting the canyon walls like a mirror. There was no sign of horses, wild or otherwise, and Jake felt disappointment settle in his chest like a stone. He dismounted and walked to where he had laid the foal that desperate morning, seeing in his mind's eye the small, shivering body wrapped in his saddle blanket. The ground told him nothing useful. 3 weeks of wind and occasional rain had erased any tracks that might have remained. He stood looking at the water, remembering the terror of seeing the foal's head dip beneath the surface, remembering the desperate pull of the current against his legs, remembering the way the mare had looked at him with eyes that held more intelligence and emotion than he had ever imagined an animal could possess. A sound from above made him look up sharply. On the canyon rim, silhouetted against the bright sky, stood a line of horses. Jake's breath caught as he counted them. 7 adults and 3 foals, a small band moving along the high trail that skirted the canyon's edge. They were too far away for him to make out individual features, but something about the lead mare's bearing made his heart begin to race. He stood perfectly still, one hand raised to shade his eyes, watching the wild band pick their way along the narrow path. They moved with the confidence of animals who knew every rock and crevice, who had traveled this route countless times before. One of the foals was smaller than the others, lighter in color, and as Jake watched, that baby moved closer to a mare who could have been the one he had rescued 3 weeks ago. The lead mare stopped and looked down into the canyon, directly at where Jake stood beside the spring. The distance was too great for him to see her expression, but he felt the weight of her gaze nonetheless. She stood for a long moment, statue still against the sky, and then she tossed her head in a gesture that Jake remembered clearly from their last encounter. His hand came up in response, another wave of farewell or greeting or acknowledgement. The mare turned and continued along the rim trail, her band following, and within minutes they had disappeared over the ridge. Jake stood looking at the empty skyline for a long time after they vanished, feeling emotions he couldn't quite name swirling through his chest. Had that been his mare? His foal? He wanted to believe it was. Wanted to think that the baby he had pulled from the water was up there somewhere, thriving and strong, living the life she was meant to live. But he would never know for certain, and perhaps that was as it should be. Wild things belonged to themselves, not to the humans who occasionally intersected with their lives. He returned to the canyon every few weeks after that, timing his visits to early morning, when the wild bands often came to drink. Sometimes he saw horses on the rim or in the distance, and sometimes the canyon was empty, except for the wind and the water and the red stone that had stood unchanged for millions of years. Each visit felt like a pilgrimage, a return to the place where something important had happened, where he had touched briefly against the wild heart of the land. On one such visit in late September, he found fresh tracks around the spring, the distinctive marks of unshod hooves pressed deep into the mud at the water's edge. He knelt to examine them, his practiced eye reading the story they told. A band had been here recently, probably the previous evening. There were tracks from several adults and at least 2 foals, one noticeably smaller than the other. Jake placed his hand in the largest track, feeling the shape of it, imagining the horse that had stood here drinking from the spring that had nearly claimed her baby's life. As he stood, something caught his eye, a flash of color against the red rock. He walked over to investigate and found a tuft of horsehair caught on a sharp stone, pale cream color with just a hint of gold. It could have been from any horse, wild or domestic, recent or old. But Jake folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket anyway, carrying it like a talisman against the forgetting that time always brought. The autumn progressed and winter came early to the high country, bringing snow that closed the mountain passes and drove the wild bands down to lower elevations. Jake saw them occasionally from a distance, dark shapes moving across white landscape, survivors in a land that tested every living thing against the hard edge of existence. He wondered how the foals were faring, whether they would make it through their first winter, whether the little cream-colored baby he had saved was among those who would see spring Christmas came and went, and then the deep cold of January settled over the land. The ranch work slowed to essential maintenance, and Jake spent long evenings by the fire with his mother, reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Sometimes she would ask if he had seen his wild horses, and he would tell her about distant sightings or fresh tracks, and she would nod with understanding that went beyond words. She knew what the rescue had meant to him, knew that it had changed something fundamental in how he saw his relationship with the land and the creatures who shared it. One February morning, Jake woke to find the world transformed by a late-season blizzard. Snow had fallen throughout the night, heavy and wet, the kind that bent trees and collapsed weak structures. He spent the morning checking on the ranch's domestic horses and cattle, making sure everyone had food and water and shelter from the storm. But his thoughts kept drifting to the wild bands, wondering where they had found refuge, hoping they had made it through the worst of the weather. By afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow covered everything in a blanket of white that reflected the returning sunlight with blinding intensity. Jake stood on the porch surveying the damage, noting several downed branches and a section of fence that would need immediate attention. But what concerned him most was the silence. The usual sounds of the ranch were muffled by snow, but there was something else missing, some background presence that he couldn't quite identify until he realized he wasn't hearing any birds or distant animal sounds at all. He saddled Copper despite his mother's protests that it was too dangerous to ride in such conditions. The gelding moved carefully through the deep snow, each step deliberate and measured, trusting Jake to guide him safely. They headed not toward the ranch's usual pastures, but toward the high country, where the wild bands typically sheltered during storms. Something was pulling Jake in that direction, some instinct or premonition that he couldn't name, but felt compelled to follow. The ride took twice as long as usual, with snowdrifts forcing them to detour repeatedly. Several times Jake considered turning back, but each time that inexplicable pull urged him forward. Copper seemed to sense his determination and pushed on without complaint, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his muscles working hard beneath Jake's weight. They climbed steadily, following the ridgeline that eventually led to a series of protected canyons where the wild horses often took refuge. What Jake found when they crested the final rise made his blood run cold. Below, in a small valley, partially hidden by trees and rock outcroppings, was a wild band trapped by snow. The storm had created drifts that blocked both entrances to the natural enclosure, leaving the horses confined with no way to reach food or water. Jake counted 9 adults and 4 foals, and even from a distance he could see they were in distress. Their heads hung low, their movements sluggish, and the foals stood pressed against their mothers for warmth. He scanned the group carefully, his heart hammering as he searched for familiar features. There, standing slightly apart from the main group, was a mare whose bearing and coloring matched the one he remembered from that August morning. And beside her, noticeably smaller than the other foals but very much alive, was a cream-colored baby, who had grown considerably but still bore the distinctive markings he had memorized during those desperate minutes at the spring. The mare saw him at the same moment he identified her. Her head came up sharply, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the expanse of snow. Recognition flickered in her eyes, and instead of the fear and flight response he expected, she took several deliberate steps toward him. It was the same gesture she had made before, a request for help, an acknowledgement that this human had proven trustworthy once and might be called upon again. Jake dismounted and moved to the edge of the drift that blocked the nearest exit from the valley. The snow was packed hard by wind, creating a wall perhaps 6 feet high and treacherously unstable. Breaking through it would require tools he didn't have, and even if he succeeded, there was no guarantee the horses would trust him enough to follow through the opening he created. He needed help, needed equipment, needed more than just himself and Copper to save this trapped band. But he also knew that time was critical. The horses had probably been without food since the storm began, nearly 24 hours ago, and while they could survive that, the foals were at greater risk. The cold was sapping their strength, and if they had to stand in that confined space for another night, some of them might not see morning. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to act smart. He made the decision quickly. He would ride back to the ranch, gather help and equipment, and return before dark to attempt a rescue. It meant leaving the horses for several more hours, meant trusting that they could hold on until he came back, but he saw no other option. He turned to remount Copper and found the mare had moved closer, standing perhaps 20 feet away now, her foal beside her. The baby looked healthy despite the circumstances, her coat full and her eyes bright, living proof that his rescue in August had mattered. The mare nickered softly, and Jake understood she was asking him not to leave, not to abandon them to whatever fate the snow had decreed. He lifted his hand in a gesture he hoped conveyed promise and commitment. "I'll come back," he said aloud, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping she would understand the intent. "I swear I'll come back with help." The mare stood watching as he mounted and turned Copper back toward home. Even as they climbed out of the valley, Jake could feel her eyes on him, could feel the weight of her trust pressing against his shoulders like a physical thing. The ride back to the ranch was faster than the journey out had been, with Copper seeming to understand the urgency and picking his own path through the snow. With minimal guidance, Jake's mind was already planning the rescue, cataloging what he would need and who he could call on for assistance. His brother Tom, despite his earlier skepticism about wild horses, their neighbor John Martinez, who had a tractor with a plow blade, maybe Doc Peterson, the veterinarian who sometimes helped with difficult animal situations. He burst into the ranch house like a whirlwind, startling his mother from her afternoon tasks. "The wild band is trapped," he announced without preamble. 9 adults and 4 foals, including the one I saved last summer. They're stuck in Blacktail Valley with no way out and no access to food or water. His mother looked at him for one long moment, reading the determination in his face, then nodded briskly and reached for her coat. "I'll call John Martinez about the tractor," she said. You get Tom and start loading the trailer with hay and tools." Jake felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who understood without question that saving wild horses in a snowstorm was worth disrupting their entire day. Within 30 minutes, they had assembled a rescue party. Tom came despite his reservations, along with John Martinez and his tractor, and Doc Peterson with his medical supplies in case any of the horses needed treatment. They loaded 3 large round bales of hay onto John's flatbed trailer, along with shovels, ropes, and anything else they thought might prove useful. The small convoy headed back toward the high country, racing against the setting sun and the dropping temperature that came with approaching night. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they reached the valley where the horses were trapped. John Martinez positioned his tractor at the top of the ridge, assessing the drift that blocked the main exit from the natural enclosure. The machine's engine rumbled loudly in the cold air, and Jake saw the wild band react with alarm, clustering together at the far end of the valley, their eyes rolling white with fear. "Wait," Jake called out over the engine noise. "We need to do this carefully or they'll panic and hurt themselves trying to escape." John cut the engine and climbed down from the cab, his weathered face skeptical. "Those horses aren't going to stand around patiently while we work," he pointed out. "Soon as we break through that drift, they're liable to stampede." "That's where Jake comes in," Tom said, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect. "He's got away with that lead mare. She trusts him." Jake walked to the edge of the valley, positioning himself where the mare could see him clearly. She stood with her band, her body tense with the protective instinct of a mother guarding her young, but when she recognized Jake, her posture changed subtly. Her ears pricked forward, her head lowered slightly, and she took several steps toward him, while the rest of the band remained where they were. The cream-colored foal followed her mother, staying close to her side but watching the humans with curiosity rather than outright fear. "Talk to her," Doc Peterson suggested quietly. "Let her know what we're planning." Jake felt slightly foolish speaking aloud to a wild horse, but he did it anyway. "We're going to clear a path out of here," he called to the mare, his voice carrying across the snow-covered valley. "There's going to be noise from the tractor and movement and people, but we're not here to hurt you. We're here to help." The mare tilted her head, listening, and Jake could have sworn he saw understanding in her dark eyes. John started the tractor again, and this time when the engine roared to life, the mare didn't bolt. She turned to look at her band, making a sound Jake had never heard from a horse before, something between a nicker and a low rumble. The other horses settled slightly, taking their cue from her calm, trusting in her judgment the way a band always trusted its lead mare. It was remarkable to witness this transmission of trust from horse to horses, this wild creature's faith in a human being extended to her entire family. The tractor's plow blade bit into the hard-packed snowdrift, pushing and scraping, slowly carving a path through the barrier that imprisoned the band. The work was harder than John had anticipated, with the blade catching on hidden rocks and the tractor's wheels spinning occasionally on ice beneath the snow. Tom and Jake worked with shovels to clear the edges of the path, widening it enough for horses to pass through safely without risking injury on sharp ice or hidden obstacles. They worked for over an hour, muscles burning with effort, sweat freezing on their faces despite the cold. The mare watched every movement, occasionally calling out to Jake as if to encourage their efforts or simply to maintain the connection between them. Her foal dozed against her legs, exhausted by hunger and cold but still alert enough to startle at particularly loud noises from the rescue operation. Finally, the path was clear, a wide corridor leading from the valley floor up to the ridge where freedom waited. John moved the tractor to one side, clearing the exit completely, and the rescue party retreated to give the horses room. Now came the difficult part, convincing wild animals to move through an opening created by humans and machinery, trusting enough to walk past their natural enemies toward an uncertain destination. Jake positioned himself at the mouth of the path they had cleared, standing in full view of the mare, Behind him on the flatbed trailer were the round bales of hay they had brought, visible proof that humans could offer sustenance as well as danger. He called to the mare using the same tone he had used that morning at the spring, calm and steady, inviting rather than commanding. She stood for a long moment, caught between instinct and experience, between the wild law that said flee from humans and the memory of a cowboy who had saved her daughter's life. Then she made her choice. She started walking toward Jake, her foal at her side, moving with deliberate purpose across the snow-covered ground. The rest of the band hesitated, confused by their leader's decision to approach rather than flee, but they followed because that was what bands did. They trusted the lead mare's judgment, even when it went against everything their wild nature told them was safe. Jake stood perfectly still as the mare approached, his heart pounding but his body language relaxed and non-threatening. She walked past him so close that he could have reached out and touched her, leading her foal and her band through the cleared path toward freedom. The other horses followed in single file, adults and foals moving together, their hooves crunching on packed snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. As they passed, Jake saw that several of the foals were in rough shape, thin and weak from the ordeal of being trapped. One little bay filly could barely walk, stumbling on legs that shook with exhaustion. Her mother nudged her encouragingly, but the baby was clearly at the end of her strength. Without thinking, Jake moved toward them, and the mare surprisingly stepped aside, allowing him to approach her foal. He scooped the baby up in his arms, feeling her weight settle against his chest as he had held the cream-colored foal months before the filly was too tired to struggle, simply resting in his hold with trust that came from complete exhaustion. Her mother followed alongside as Jake carried her baby up the path to where the hay waited, setting her down gently near the feed where she could eat and rest. The mare with the cream foal stood at the top of the ridge, watching as Jake helped the struggling filly. When he looked up, she was there, waiting, her daughter beside her. She approached him one more time, close enough that her breath warmed his cold, numbed face. Then she touched her nose to his hand in a gesture that needed no interpretation. It was gratitude, pure and simple, offered by a wild creature to the human who had now twice proven himself worthy of trust. The band moved away into the gathering dusk, heading toward Winter Range where grass would be accessible beneath the snow. John had positioned one of the hay bales at the valley entrance, breaking it open so the horses could feed before beginning their journey. The wild band fell on the food with desperate hunger, and Jake watched with satisfaction as the mare's foal, his foal, pushed in to eat alongside the others, strong and healthy and alive because of a choice he had made on a summer morning. The story of the winter rescue spread even faster than the tale of the drowning foal had months before. Within days, newspapers from 3 counties had called asking for interviews, and a reporter from Denver made the long drive to hear firsthand about the cowboy who had befriended a wild Mustang mare. Jake turned down most of the requests, uncomfortable with the attention. But he couldn't stop people from talking about what had happened in Blacktail Valley. What interested him more than the human reaction was what happened with the wild band over the following months. The mare and her group didn't vanish back into the wilderness, as he had half expected. Instead, they established a pattern of appearing near the ranch boundaries, close enough to be seen but not so close as to invite capture or interference. It was as if the mare had decided that proximity to this particular human and his land offered advantages worth the risk of being near civilization. Jake saw them often that spring as the snow melted and new grass greened the hillsides. The cream-colored foal had grown considerably, her legs lengthening and her body filling out with the robust health of a young horse thriving in her natural environment. She played with the other foals in the band, racing across meadows and rearing up in mock battles that taught the lessons of dominance and submission necessary for adult herd life. But sometimes she would stop her play and look toward wherever Jake was working, as if she too remembered that morning at the spring. The bay filly he had carried up from the valley had also survived. Though she remained smaller and more delicate than the other foals, Jake often wondered if his intervention had truly helped or simply delayed the inevitable. Nature had its own harsh calculus for determining which animals survived and which didn't, and human interference didn't always improve outcomes. But watching her prance alongside her mother one morning, full of life and energy, despite her smaller size, he decided that every day lived was worth the effort it took to preserve it. His mother noticed the change in him that year. Margaret would find him standing on the porch at odd hours, looking toward the high country, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're different since that morning at the spring," she observed one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "More settled somehow, like you found something you didn't know you were looking for." Jake considered her words carefully before responding. "I think I just learned that we're not as separate from the wild things as we like to believe," he said finally. "That mare trusted me with the most precious thing in her world, and that trust changed how I see everything." Tom came around to his brother's perspective eventually, though he would never admit it directly. Jake noticed his younger brother taking longer routes during his own ranch work, routes that happened to pass near places where the wild band was often seen. Once he caught Tom sitting motionless on his horse, watching the mustangs graze in a distant meadow, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. They didn't discuss it. But the next time someone in town made a disparaging comment about worthless wild horses eating grass that could feed cattle, Tom was the one who spoke up in their defense. Summer returned to Red Rock Country, bringing with it the cycle of work that defined ranch life. But Jake made time every few weeks to ride up to the canyon spring where everything had begun. He no longer went hoping to see the mare and her band, though he was always pleased when they appeared. Instead, he went because the place had become sacred to him in a way he couldn't quite articulate, a thin place where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had proven permeable. On a morning in late August, exactly 1 year after the original rescue, Jake was at the spring checking the water flow when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He looked up to see the mare walking down the canyon trail, her yearling daughter at her side. But something was different. The mare's belly was swollen with late pregnancy, proof that life continued its relentless cycle regardless of human intervention. She would foal soon, perhaps within days, and she had chosen to bring her almost grown daughter to this place. The yearling, no longer cream-colored but darkening to the same golden shade as her mother, walked directly up to Jake with none of the wild wariness he would have expected. She stretched out her nose and sniffed his hand, her whiskers tickling his palm, her dark eyes curious and unafraid. The mare watched this interaction with what Jake could only describe as approval, as if she had brought her daughter here specifically for this introduction, specifically to show the young horse that this human could be trusted. Jake stood very still, barely breathing, as the yearling explored him with her nose, learning his scent and presence. She was beautiful, already showing the strong confirmation and alert intelligence that would make her a successful lead mare someday. He wondered if she remembered being pulled from the water as a newborn, if some deep part of her recalled the terror and exhaustion and the strange creature who had saved her. Probably not, he decided. But her mother remembered, and that was enough. The mare called to her daughter after a few minutes, and the yearling stepped back obediently. Mother and daughter stood together at the spring's edge, drinking deeply from water that had nearly claimed one of their lives. Then the mare looked at Jake one final time, her expression holding what he chose to interpret as peace and recognition, and perhaps even affection. She turned and led her daughter back up the canyon trail, their hooves clicking on stone, their bodies moving with the fluid grace that defined their kind. Jake watched them disappear into the landscape, knowing he might never see them this close again, knowing that their paths might diverge from this point forward. But he also knew that somewhere in these canyons a young mare would grow to adulthood, carrying the gift of life he had given her. She would have foals of her own someday, would lead her own band through the cycles of seasons. would pass on the strength and resilience that allowed wild things to survive in harsh country. And perhaps, if he was very fortunate, one of her daughters or granddaughters would someday trust a human the way her mother had trusted him, completing a circle of connection that spanned generations. The thought made him smile as he mounted Copper and turned toward home. He had risked everything to save a baby in answer to a wild mare's desperate plea, and in doing so, he had saved something in himself as well. The memory of that trust, that moment of connection across the vast divide of species, would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that courage and compassion could bridge any distance, and that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply answer when help was asked for, regardless of the cost.